Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba.
Welcome, everyone, to this interview with the winner of the 2015 Raven Award for Excellence in Arts and Entertainment, the talented Paul King, the writer and director of the fabulous movie Paddington. I'm Suzanne Ross of the Raven Foundation, and Paul, congratulations on the success of Paddington. I know audiences worldwide have enjoyed it and loved it, and I want to thank you for joining me for this conversation today.
It's my great pleasure, and thank you for your kind words.
Oh, well, Paul, you may probably never have heard of the Raven Award before you won it, but
it's always the best way to discover awards.
There you go. Well, it is a bit unusual because it's not restricted to one genre. It's not like a movie award or a book award or something like that. Our first winner was actually a playwright from a local theater here in Chicago, the Looking Glass Theater. Her name is Heidi Stillman, and she won for a stage adaptation of the Russian novel The Brothers Karamazov, which is probably pretty far from Paddington. I don't know.
Quite far. That sounds like a harder adaptation to get down to sort of 2 hours.
Well, it was incredible. I keep asking her to restage it, but we'll see what happens.
Great.
The next year, we honored a composer, Stephen Schwartz, for the musical Wicked. We've also honored a documentary filmmaker, Kevin Miller, for a documentary about hell. And we've given the award to a local sculptor doing peacemaking work and to a first-time novelist. So you might ask, what unites all these artists? Well, they're exceptional artists, and that puts you in that category quite easily. But we also honor, the Raven Award honors artists for their creative representation of some aspect of mimetic theory, something that only 2 of the past winners had ever heard about before they won the award. And I'll let you guess who they were. But mimetic theory, quite simply, is just a theory of human relationships that sort of documents the ways in which we get tangled up in conflicts driven by fear or hatred. But what interests us at the Raven Foundation is that it also shines a spotlight on the reversal that can take place, how you can move out of conflict towards more loving and more peaceful relationships, kind of with the very people that were driving you crazy in the conflict, right? And we think that great artists are already in touch with these truths, and they don't need mimetic theory to explain it to them, although your work goes a long way to helping people really get into the understanding of these reversals that can take place in relationships, more than just talking about a theory, which is why we decided to give this award and really highlight exceptional work, not just the artistry, but the meaning and themes that are being engaged by the work. So, Paul, before I let you do some talking, I would just like to, by way of introducing you a little more to our audience, let our audience know that Paddington was nominated in 2015 in 2 categories by BAFTA, the British Academy of Film and Television Arts, which sounds like the Oscars and Emmys sort of combined.
Yes, I think it's exactly that.
It's that, okay. And you were nominated for Best British Film, which is quite an honor. I looked at the films that were in that category with you, and the 2 that really jumped out at me were Theory of Everything, which was in that category, and The Imitation Game. So, I mean, Paddington is just, wow, in good company, right?
Very good company, and very sort of unusual company for a family film. They don't always get the kind of, they don't get a look in always. So that was very flattering and much appreciated.
Well, and I think part of why it was up there was because of the screenplay. You also were nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay.
Yes.
And you also won the BAFTA Best Film Award in the Children's BAFTA category,
yes,
right?
yes,
So I mean
yes.
that's and you also received the Empire Award for Best Comedy.
Yes, we've been very, very lucky.
Not at all. I think
Blessed with the film industry's desire to award itself at every opportunity. But as if there weren't enough plus sides already to getting to do this fantastic job. But it's very nice.
Isn't it wonderful? Well, you are known as a director of comedies.
Yes.
And you're interested, I, not being a fan of necessarily British comedy TV,
No.
never heard of The Mighty Boosh.
Yes, that puts you in the vast majority of people on the planet. But
Well, it's described as a cult classic, which...
it's something like that, yeah.
Is it? Yes. Okay.
Generally means nobody watched it, but the people who did liked it.
There you go.
So that's okay.
It has a strong core fan base. That's what.
Yes, it does. It did sort of quite well in Britain, but I don't think it ever travelled. It's very much in the kind of surreal sort of tradition of, I suppose Monty Python and Spike Milligan and Douglas Adams, and it's really I'm hugely proud of it and love the writers who also acted in it. It was a sort of double act, and I was hugely fond of the whole process, but. It never sort of. I don't think it made huge waves outside Britain, but here it did
Okay,
quite
well, good. Then I don't feel too bad that I.
There's no shame
heard
at
of
all.
it. And in that line of inventive, imaginative comedy, you have a road trip movie too called Bunny and the Bull, which seems like it's in that realm of highly imaginative journeys.
Yes, well, I wanted to do something. As a sort of a remembered thing. I was sort of interested in the ideas of memory at that point, and it was about somebody who had sort of become a bit of a shut-in in their flat. So the kind of pitch of the film was it's a road movie, but entirely set in someone's flat. So the film was sort of mostly a remembered journey, but it was set in the souvenirs and old postcards and kind of relics of the journey, the kind of detritus that this character has sort of hoarded. And so as he sort of saw the old memories, they would sort of come to life. So part of it was set in a snow globe of Switzerland when he remembered sort of driving through it. So it was sort of part animated and part live action. And it was really an experiment, but it was great fun. I was very proud of it and worked with some fantastic people. And it was a really nice first exploration of writing for me, I suppose, because I hadn't really written something on my own before that. So that was the first screenplay I wrote. And it did sort of, for what it was, for a low budget British film, it kind of did okay, but it took something like $50,000 at the box office. And so I was slightly intimidated when David and Rosie and the people at Heyday came and asked me to sort of drive Paddington, which was going to cost about 50 million. I couldn't help feeling there'd been a kind of massive mistake, and they were just going to wake up one day and realise they should have got somebody who knew what he was doing. But what's so lovely about them is they're prepared to take a risk on people who have, who they feel they have the right instincts and need some guidance, and that's very much what I got from them, a huge amount of guidance, and I really learned pretty much everything I know from them, and it's been a great journey.
Well, they obviously were looking for someone with a knack for comedy.
I think so. Yes.
And obviously also someone who could imagine an imaginary world.
Yes, and I was a big fan of Paddington, and what there was a sort of 1970s stop frame animation of Paddington, and which has a very distinctive look. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it sort of has cardboard cutouts for all of the characters and all of the sets, like hardly coloured in, sort of like black and white drawings, more or less. And then Paddington's the only real three-dimensional object. He's a sort of maquette, but it's a beautiful piece of work, and I was a huge fan of that long before I knew there was going to be a film of Paddington or anything. And I used that style for part of Bunny and the Bull. So I think they kind of knew that I was a fan of Paddington, and hopefully that I liked the comedy but wanted to do something with heart. And I think it was really our shared ambition that kind of got me the job, because I spoke to David and Rosie, and you feel you're putting your head in the lion's mouth when you take on a sort of beloved children's character, and that people don't always respond positively to the films, and the films aren't always very good and possibly don't deserve people to respond positively to them. But I suppose we wanted to do something which was very sensitive and very respectful, but was also a film with style and meaning. And we kind of referenced, I suppose, Pixar movies and sort of, really sort of wanted something that an audience would respond to at an emotional level rather than, Paddington's a slapstick character, and it would have been not easy, but relatively more straightforward to kind of put him in a series of comic set pieces. But we really wanted people to laugh as well as cry and feel that they left the cinema with having seen something that had something to say.
Absolutely. Yeah.
We just had to figure out what it was we were trying to say.
Exactly. And that's what I'd love to have you talk about a little bit. What is it about this character of Paddington you think that would lend itself to that kind of, meaningful story?
Well, it's interesting because I think that meaning in films is often sort of an underexplored area. There's a sort of lot of books and lectures and things on how to sort of write a screenplay and the shape of a screenplay and how you structure things, and they almost always don't really talk about the meaning of the piece. They sort of talk about character journeys and arcs and moments where things are good and bad and odd couples and finales, and there's a lot of sort of structure talk, but how you actually give a piece meaning is quite an interesting and kind of little explored area. I mean, I think some people set out to make a film to kind of illustrate a point that they've already thought of. They sort of want to go, I want to show how community is more powerful than the individual, or love conquers all, or something. And then you can kind of really find a story to sort of fit that. I suppose with an adaptation, especially something like Paddington, there are some sort of givens that will precede that. Like what you actually know is, well, there's going to be a talking bear. He is going to come from darkest Peru. He's going to arrive in London. He's going to be taken in by a family. Some of the kind of the very, very broad strokes of the story are sort of set in stone. And really, then it's a kind of question of going, well, what is it about this story that I respond to? Why is it that I remember, children's literature is rammed with talking animals and, these sort of things. Why is it that Paddington stood the test of time? Why is it that I was so attracted to the proposition of a film being made about him and not kind of, who's Paddington? And it was really looking into kind of what it was that was special about him and his character that had kind of endured. And it seemed to me that what was most interesting about Paddington was that he was an outsider, and the kind of the most famous image of Paddington, he's very famous, especially in Britain, I think, but, in many territories, but in lots of, especially in Britain. And he even has a statue. He's one of, I think, 3 children's characters that has a statue in London. I think the others are fictional characters. I think the others are Peter Pan in Hyde Park, and there's one of Sherlock Holmes at Baker Street. So Paddington is really in that top kind of tier of beloved national treasures. And the statue of him is the image of him sitting on his suitcase alone at Paddington Station with his label around his neck. And it seemed to me there's sort of some evocation there of evacuees, certainly from the Second World War, and Michael Bond's spoken about this, and kids that came over in the Kindertransport, maybe Jewish children in the 30s, and then British children being sent away from London during the Blitz in the 40s. So, and it was really a sense of kind of these children being sent into the unknown and sort of trying to find a place. And that seemed to me that that's not something you find in every talking animal movie. This is touching something much deeper and more profound. And that was kind of really the sort of way into the story to sort of go, well, here we have a character who's been sent halfway around the world by a parent. There's got to be, or a parent figure in Aunt Lucy, and there's got to be a good reason for that. And the challenge of what that means to a family who take him up. And in the books, the Browns adopt Paddington very quickly, sort of almost immediately. And it seemed to me that there's, and then at the beginning of chapter 5, I think it is, they sort of take him, and some of the most famous set pieces sort of take place straight away, like the tea room, and he goes to the bathroom, and he goes on the underground. There's some funny, and then there's a sentence which sort of goes, I can't remember exactly, but something like, a few weeks passed, and before he knew it, Paddington was part of the family. And it seemed to me, well, there's kind of, in a way, part of the story that's never been told, and we can make a film that sat within this kind of canon of stories about Paddington without kind of upsetting any of the others or making them untrue, and that really is the heart of it. And nowadays, probably more than ever, we are not used to children arriving in our country kind of uninvited and certainly not unaccompanied in a way that they probably were in the 30s and 40s, in the times that were inspiring Michael Bond when he first wrote the stories. But we do obviously have, everyone's been an outsider, and there are real challenges. So it struck me that sort of eventually that there were sort of two aspects that were really interesting. One of them was, how do you respond if you're the Browns, and if you see this kind of scruffy urchin, ruffian, kind of Oliver Twist type figure in the street? And obviously for the audience, we go, well, he's Paddington, he's a sweet little fluffy bear. But so there's some comedy there in Mr. Brown going, oh, stranger danger, and not wanting to kind of engage with him. But I feel we're all guilty of that all the time. We walk past homeless people 50 times a day, and, you may stop one of those times if you're lucky. And we've become very good at kind of blinding ourselves to the problems around us and sort of dismissing them as somebody else's problem. And so Mr. Brown felt like that was an interesting journey for him. And then obviously the other side of the story is Paddington's, and going, well, what's it like to be a stranger in another land? And again, this is something that not every talking animal story has addressed. And it seems to me like we have all been outsiders. You don't have to have left Peru and travelled to halfway around the world. You had your first day at school. You've left home. You've sort of almost everyone from almost any age that you can start to speak has been nervous in a new environment. And that seems sort of the two sides of what could be an interesting story and some interesting areas to explore.
Right, absolutely.
Sorry, very long answer.
I loved it. You covered so much of what I wanted to ask you about. Rosie Allison, the executive producer, said in the production notes, says Paddington is really the quintessential refugee. And Paul has woven in all echoes of other immigrant stories. And I think that that's part of what is so interesting to me about the movie, is it has resonances at a personal level, but also sort of at a community level, at a political and policy level. It's like It opens up all kinds of conversations about, as you're saying, the intersection of this very sort of trusting, vulnerable little bear.
Yes.
And this reaction by Mr. Brown of danger.
Yeah.
And I would love to have just to talk a little bit about Mr. Brown and why you think because I think you developed him very beautifully in the movie as a character. And at first, like you say, it's comic. He's afraid of this little bear. Why would he?
Yes.
But then we learned a little bit about him. And can you talk about why he would see the bear as a threat or as something to be afraid of?
Well, I suppose, yes. I mean, I suppose there's a comic juxtaposition in this small, fluffy creature and his response. But like I say, I do feel we respond like that all the time. I feel that, if not to talking bears that don't sadly litter the streets of London, but we do see scary, different other things around us all the time. And our instinct as flawed humans, I believe, is to tribalize ourselves around and we sort of, we tend to cluster in very similar minded people, whether it be your politics or your age or your ethnicity or your gender or your, financial status. And I do find that we put ourselves in little groups, and that almost anyone from any other group, whichever direction it's coming from, can seem like a scary other. So I think there's a recognizable truth in how Henry responds. And I suppose because I wanted, but rather than simply going, well, he's a baddie because he won't talk to the kind of, the little foreign kid on the station, I also wanted to kind of understand why that was, and rather than just going, he does this and this is this terrible thing. Because I think another habit that movies have is finding somebody whose sort of politics or reactions that we as an audience will disapprove of, they're kind of made into a baddie, and it's never explained why they might be, all of the sort of terrible things they are. And people who are sort of just bad, I don't generally believe exist, and they're certainly not terribly interesting characters. It's very hard to make a kind of somebody who just hates bears without giving them a reason, because you go, well, who is this person and why are they like that? And I thought what was nice about Henry, it took a while to sort of discover this, but was this kind of idea that it really came out of love of his family, to find sort of something that has manifested itself as a slightly unhealthy instinct, like being afraid of outsiders, and go, well, why are we afraid of outsiders? Because we think they might hurt us, and we think they might hurt the ones we love. And I rather like the idea of, I don't have children, but many of my friends do, and I've kind of watched them go from being these sort of super open-minded, relaxed, liberal, easygoing people, and then as soon as they got a child, it's like they sort of put themselves in, put that down, stop that. No, I've got and it's very entertaining to watch, and of course completely understandable. And why wouldn't you be? Because you have this incredibly vulnerable thing, and I think there's a sort of, it can become a metaphor for a country as well, of sort of going, well, we have this thing and we think it's working quite nicely as it is, and I'm rather afraid of these other things coming in. I mean, Paddington's clearly a foreigner, if nothing else, and it's sort of, you can take something deeply personal and deeply relatable and hopefully sort of hint at the sort of wider politics of it. I mean, we were always very keen that sort of Paddington had become sort of too political a film with a sort of capital P. You know, it's certainly not sort of party political, but in the lovely way that fiction can. It can kind of hint at things and sort of suggest ideas or topics of conversation without sort of being, sort of seeing anyone in too bad a light, or kind of feeling like you're standing up and making a great statement at the end of it.
Yes, of course. I think you succeeded admirably in making it too political, but as I said, raising these questions.
Yes.
And I think one of the things about Mr. Brown and the family is that you really do explore the ways in which Mr. Brown sort of he's a risk analyst, which I thought was lovely.
Yes. I think
he's a risk analyst, and the way his concern about risk affected all of his relationships then within the family.
Yes.
It didn't just affect whether or not he could welcome strangers or not.
No.
And so I wonder, and I think that was a really powerful issue for you to raise, because it changes your ability to relate to the ones you love by how you're relating to those who are different.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. I suppose it feels, I suppose I wanted the idea that he'd sort of ended up, through the best possible motives and with nothing but love in his heart, slightly closing this family in, and sort of the children, especially Jonathan, were kind of, well, I want to go and play with more exciting toys, and you sort of feel he would be very sensible and go, well, I think soft play is best until the age of 21, and I'd really like all sharp corners covered in foam. I mean, it's a comedic idea, but I think it's also true. I mean, you can't help but want to protect the ones you love, and again, to show that it comes from such a lovely place, but that sort of letting a little bit of danger into your life and a little bit of the unknown can be enriching, sort of to be open to those experiences. And it's very much based on myself and my wife. My wife is a wonderful, open-hearted, glorious person who is always striking up conversation with strangers on the street while I hang back nervously wanting to go home. So the faults are all massively mine.
It's wonderful. I mean, well, I think that's, one of the reasons we're afraid of differences is just because it will change us. I mean, you welcome someone different into the home, and I love that. Paddington, Mr. Brown was right to be a little frightened of having a bear in the house.
Yes. He will trash the bathroom, but he will improve your marmalade cooking.
Exactly.
And swings and roundabouts.
And it enlivened his relationship with his wife quite beautifully. I love the theme of Mrs. Brown looking for a hero. In her work, she's an illustrator, and she's can't find what the face of the hero is in the story.
Yes.
Sort of alongside the villain. In the story, who is Millicent, I think.
That's right, yes.
Millicent is the character's name, played by Nicole Kidman, who also apparently had a love of Paddington as a child.
I know, thank goodness.
Thank goodness, right? But there's this, in this wonderful, entertaining, beautifully imagine children's story, you do this very in-depth exploration of the villain hero sort of dynamic, if you will,
Yeah.
because Millicent is, she is terrible in her aims.
Yes, she is.
Wants to do to Paddington is just horrible. Like you say, it's easy to dislike her.
Yes,
very
she's
easily.
very good at playing a baddie.
She does a good job. But what we find out about her near the end of the movie, and I don't want to give away the whole reveal, but we do find that in this weird way, she's motivated by sort of a love and protectiveness towards her dad.
Yes.
To me, mirrored Mr. Brown's love and protectiveness towards his family.
Yes, that was definitely the ambition, to sort of go, well, they're sort of, in a way, they're sort of two characters who have had, if not the same experience, sort of elements of the same and two different ways of responding to it, and whether you let the idea of other, I mean, I suppose I was interested in different responses to Paddington, and this sort of becomes quite specifically bear-based, but I think the implications can spread a little wider, but that the warm-hearted Mrs. Brown sees a soul in distress and reaches out to help him, and that is fairly uncriticised by the film. Mr. Brown loves his family so much he sees a stranger, and it's not that he doesn't want Paddington to be looked after. He sort of feels he should be looked after, and there should be a mechanism, and ideally a government department of bears that takes care of these things, and he would happily write a check if that's what it took, but not in my house, which I think is probably where most of the audience are probably somewhere on that scale. And then there's Millicent, who really goes, bears do not belong in this society, full stop. They are a sort of subhuman, and they are, they belong in a museum, and that's her response. And I think you can pick the kind of the metaphor to suit you, but that was the sort of idea of a sliding scale, and certainly she sort of allies herself with another character, Mr. Curry, who's one of the neighbours, and he's very much I don't want a bear in my street. Again, he wouldn't go quite as far as sort of I think they should be stuffed, but he probably wouldn't want them in Britain. So there's these different responses to Paddington from different characters, and they sort of, I think they all sort of have echoes that we see in, this year, especially the last sort of 12 months, the kind of asylum and refugee issues been playing, very strongly in the media, and very different responses at different times for different reasons. And we're in the midst of this great crisis, which is clearly a very personal humanitarian crisis for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And it's a real challenge to us as countries as to how we respond. And it's sort of, it feels like an eternal issue that will never go away. It may be bigger or smaller in different years, but the planet hasn't existed for millions of years without some displaced people really struggling, and it's hard not to worry about that,
isn't it? And I think what your movie sort of invites us to think about is people that may disagree with us on the correct way to respond.
Yes,
it's not going to help to demonize them.
No.
And to see the humanity in their position, to see that it is motivated by genuine love or concern or fear, and to honor that, to me, that you were opening up this way forward, I think. And Mr. Brown said there's some wonderful lines near the end of the movie that really point to this, what we call here a reversal from being frightened and afraid of that stranger to welcoming the change that stranger can have on you. I mean, it's this because I think a lot of it is fear of change, which is a legitimate fear. I will be a different person if I let this event, circumstance into my life. I would.
Yes.
Right. So.
Yes.
Do you want to comment on that before I read Mr. Brown?
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that I think it applies on a personal level as well as a kind of a nationwide level. That
Exactly.
You sort of go, well, clearly having somebody to stay in your house is going to make a huge upheaval for your house. Having tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people coming to live in your country will change the nature of your country.
Right.
And I completely agree that to demonize anyone on any side of that conversation is very unhelpful, even if it's people who go, well, I like my country as it is and I don't want it to change. You go, well,
Yes.
that isn't understandable and relatable, and it might not be my politics, but it might, there's nothing wrong with that opinion. And I feel the danger is always in sort of, I feel that I certainly and many people we want to understand news stories and human issues in terms of right and wrong and goodies and baddies and the right opinion, and it sort of leads to slanging matches that get you nowhere. Whereas I think you're absolutely right. If you can understand that the people arriving are people, the people who are welcoming them are
Yes.
people, the people who are not so welcoming to the people that everyone has good reasons and are understandable as characters and as genuine, heartfelt responses. It's really important, and it's just very important. It chimes with what we were saying about writing baddies, is that nobody wakes up in the morning and goes, I'm going to be evil today. I don't know that character.
Despite what we see in the movies, often.
Yes, exactly. Well, in the movies, they often do.
They often do. It's,
to make a good character in a film that's sort of 85 minutes long, and you have to go for these shorthands. But I think they can end up being very destructive. And my favourite children's films don't really have villains like that. So it was an interesting challenge to try and write a baddie, because I felt the story needed one as a sort of motor, but to try and do one who hopefully at least was understandable and redeemed in some way at the end. It felt important.
Yes, well, yes, it was well achieved. And I think the other thing the movie asks us to do is, when we first are welcoming or imagining a stranger, if it's a new kid in the classroom or
Yes.
an immigrant on our shores, we immediately think of, what could go wrong?
Yes.
What am I going to lose?
Yes.
But your movie says, wait a minute, there might be something good that can happen here. We might become better than we were. We
Yes.
might gain something
Yes.
by welcoming the stranger.
Yes.
And I think that is probably, that's the thing that sort of brings tears to my eyes, and that really makes the end of the movie so powerful, because we do see what the Brown family gains by welcoming this odd creature. And Henry's line, now I hear this with you talking about your wife now, but he says, when I first met Paddington, I wanted nothing to do with him. But my wonderful wife, she opened her heart to him, and so did my incredible children, and now I have too. It doesn't matter that he comes from the other side of the world, or that he's a different species, or that he has a worrying marmalade habit. We love Paddington, and that makes him family. And I just, I cry just reading.
Oh, good.
But it's just a very powerful example of that reversal can happen when we just shift a little bit of our orientation from what could go wrong to, wait a minute.
Yes. What are the positives?
Yeah.
Yes, and I think there's a challenge. One of the sort of things that I discovered making the film about that particular speech was, we sort of had this speech from Henry, and I was really pleased with the writing. And this is sort of a maybe too tedious a technical thing, but Paddington himself as a character is incredibly expensive to make because he's all animated. So he's something like $10,000 a second or something. So you use your Paddington shots very, very sparingly, and you want to make sure that each one's really worth it. And one of the things in budgeting the film, because it's not a kind of $200 million Hollywood movie, it's financed by a French company, and it's a sort of, it's a smaller budget than you would normally make this sort of a story on. So we were really kind of careful and prudent with our use of Paddington. But in that speech that Henry gave, I sort of was planning to just have a shot of Henry like I'm now and not really see Paddington. And then ended up putting more and more Paddington shots into it at vast expense, because it felt like that speech was for him, but it was also very much about Paddington and Paddington's journey. And it's this sort of, I discovered as we made the film, that really the story, as well as being about Henry and his response, is about Paddington and his response, because he's sent to London by Aunt Lucy, who tells him this story of England and evacuees and how they took in strange children and looked after them. And that's why she sends him to London, because she has this slightly misguided belief that London is a city where they welcome strangers. And of course, if Paddington gets to London, it's nothing like that at all. It's busy people going about their lives, trying to ignore anything that might get in their way.
Yes.
And so she has assumed the best of London, and Paddington has seen the real London, which is possibly not the best of London. And so that end speech, when Henry sort of does that speech, it seems to me it's not just about him realising what's good, but about Paddington realising that the expectation of kindness in others can sometimes breed that kindness itself. And so that it's like London has become its best self because Paddington has come there with his heart open. And it reminds me of this really lovely story that a great theatre director, Peter Hall, told of making audiences respond emotionally. And he sort of said it's very much about never have an actor cry, have them trying not to cry. Which was a really interesting thing, because he said if a child runs up to you with kind of tears streaming, your immediate response is to kind of back away. But if a child comes, you kind of want to give them a hug. And it's that seemed like very much the kind of dynamic there of, looking for the best in people, you can sometimes find it, if you look for the best in people. And that seemed like a very positive idea.
Well,
share with small people.
That's a very mimetic theory thing to say, Paul.
Oh, great. Oh, good. Excellent.
That's exactly what we talk about a lot, about how the way we respond to one another makes us into something new and different.
Right.
And
yes.
we can, we don't exist in isolation. We're not separate entities.
Yes.
We exist in these relationships.
Yes. Yes, and so Henry realises that he can have a bear in his life, and Paddington realises he can belong with this strange family. Yeah, so it's hopefully two sides of the same.
It's quite beautiful.
Point.
And we haven't mentioned the daughter yet, but I just kind of want to wrap up with this wonderful little quote that Judy is afflicted with a bad case of embarrassment,
yes.
According to Barrett. Her family embarrasses her because she's very self-conscious. She's a teenager. She's
just going into that.
At school and so
yes, and she has it's always seemed quite fun to me because she sort of, I kind of wanted each of the kids in the film to sort of naturally ally themselves with one parent and sort of against the other in a way that seems like quite often happens in family dynamics. So she sort of thinks Dad's kind of okay because at least he just goes to work and keeps out of the way, whereas her mother is this kind of big, sort of slightly hippie-ish, sort of a lot of knitwear, and definitely the sort of mother who would kind of come and give you a big hug and kiss on your first day of sort of high school, and you go, the worst nightmare.
The worst nightmare, I know.
But too much kindness can be a bad thing.
Well, true. Well, somehow, you in a short amount of time managed to let us see the kids have their own journeys as well. And
yes.
Judy's... at the end of the movie, says to a boyfriend she has over, after her mom does her weird, embarrassing things.
Yes.
She says, well, she's weird, but we all are. Until there's this acceptance of difference.
Yes.
And Paddington, in the letter home to his Aunt Lucy, says, Mrs. Brown says that in London everyone is different, but that means anyone can fit in. And I just thought that was such a wonderful take on difference as we've been talking about.
Yes.
And it's just such a hopeful way to end a movie about the impact of the stranger in our midst. Whether personal or corporate. So, Paul, thank you for your work on Paddington, for giving us a fabulous family movie that we'll be talking about with our families and friends for a long time. I hope there's more Paddington to come. Can we
certainly
keep our fingers crossed? There might be another one.
Yes, so I'm writing it sort of not literally now, but 5 minutes before we started this conversation, I was. So yes, it's great fun. It's a lovely world to spend time in. It's very cozy and sort of. It's a very nice space, and he's such a lovely character that I want to spend as long with him as I can.
Well, good. You brought a whole new generation of people to the love of Paddington. So
Thank you.
thank you so much, and congratulations again.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.